Well, I have to begin, of course, with thanking the Dialogue Society for inviting me and giving the generous opportunity to basically test some ideas. I'm going to use you a little bit as guinea pigs, not really, more as a soundboard for some ideas I have, and I want to find out if I'm right, especially about that comparison between what's going on in Indonesia and the developments in Turkey. I know very little about Turkey, the audience probably knows much more about it, but I have a hunch that in what you call civil society, a lot of similar things are going on, in spite of cultural differences. Yeah. Then I have to also extend an apology for again milking that term young Turks that has been abused and used so much in all kinds of contexts that I could not come up with anything better. And I do think it's appropriate if we look at that trend of thought and type of Muslim thinkers I want to introduce today. The kind of people who rattle the cage. Yeah, media coverage indeed is see a lot of this stuff, huh? Media. When people talk about the Islamic world or even about the Muslim diaspora, it not just focuses primarily on political Islam, it amplifies also the radicalized and extremist exponents of it. And much less attention is indeed paid to different strands of thought, especially if they deal with things that are not, say, really political, directly political. Now, what I think is that these alternative discourses, to use the postmodernist term, they are particularly vibrant in the geographical peripheries of the Muslim. And what I'm trying to do in the presentation today is to look at the emergence of new Muslim intellectuals in Indonesia in the final decades of the 20th century and at the beginning of the new millennium, of course. And then the secondary thesis connected with that is indeed that in spite of these cultural differences, are there indeed some similarities between developments in the Turkish Republic and in the Republic of Indonesia after 1945? Yeah? So there I basically rely on the audience to affirm that and also point out where the differences are. There are probably a few things you start recognizing as I progress in my talk. The main similarity I want to point up is that as Muslim nations, Turkey and Indonesia try to accommodate, in a way, the majority religious beliefs within political systems that are not overtly Islamic, far from it actually, and to continue to draw on Islam what I would call, say, a spiritual and moral compass. Now, this role as an ethical guideline is in a way also politically significant, especially with respect to the type of thought I'm going to talk about. Because even when they are not dealing directly with political issues or having an overtly Islamist agenda, in Indonesia what these people advocate is called Islam Sipil, Islam liberal or civil Islam. It does have political implications. Now, in what way? It has to do with demographics. Only last week, I heard a very senior Indonesian government official, it was in Chatham House, so I cannot reveal his identity, but it was very convenient for me what he launched there, because it sort of ties in what I'm going to talk about. What he said was that if you look at, if the government wants to make any progress in regards to fair distribution of economic prosperity and engage in democracy building, and he was not talking about formal democracy, you know, elections and things like that. He was talking about substantive democracy, changing a society and making that democratic, than merely going through the motions of elections and having a parliament and things like that. If you want that, he said, it is mandatory for a country like Indonesia to quadruple in the next 15 years its middle class, which now stands at 15%. So it has to become 60%, they said. Because he says the middle classes are like a transmission belt between the elites and, say, the masses. And they're still very vast in Indonesia. You have to come to a complete transformation there if you want to achieve anything. Now, the constituency which both generates and consumes the kind of Islamic thought I'm talking about are the middle classes. So if a country like Indonesia wants to go the way they envisage, then this kind of thought becomes terribly important, and that could very well become eventually, or has to become, the majority view. So we better sort of become acquainted with that kind of thought or discourse, or what these people stand for and what they want. Now, what is the genealogy or the origins of this particular Muslim discourse? Now, I'm a bit of a history buff, I must confess, and I sort of assume that you maybe don't know very much about Southeast Asian Islam, so I want to go a little bit into history first, also because there are certain elements which evolved historically, which make Indonesian Islam into the kind of Islam it is now. Yeah? So I hope you will bear with me if I give first a historical sketch of the Islamization of Southeast Asia. And actually then you see the Turkish world feature here and there already. Yeah. So the connections I am making, they're not frivolous or just like, well, you have this Turkish Republic with a secular constitution and Indonesia has something similar. Presto, that's it. These two nations have been in touch with each other for centuries. They know about each other's existence, and in spite of cultural differences, I think they have shared many historical experiences as well. We should not forget about that. Now, if you look at the history of how Southeast Asia became Islamized, scholars have presented very different scenarios, and there has been a lot of disagreement. There's two things they agree about. Number one, it occurred relatively late, around the 13th century, and it was peaceful and gradual. Yeah. So Indonesia was not caught up in the expensive wars of the early Islamic era at all. The strange thing is why nothing happened basically for 500-600 years. I mean, there was trade between Southeast Asia and what was becoming the Muslim world. Arabs and Persians had traveled across the Indian Ocean long before they became Muslims. And yet it didn't take. Yeah. But the Indian Ocean becomes very important in my story. And especially to show the cultural hybridity of Islam in this part of Southeast Asia. Yeah? Now, what do we know about the Islamization? The first evidence, I said it starts around the 13th century. How do we know that? Well, it's scanty circumstantial evidence. They found a few tombstones in northern Sumatra, this island here, and later also here in the eastern parts of Java, the most populous island. And these tombstones were Islamic tombstones, Arabic script, Muslim names. Now, the only thing you mean is that there were Muslims present, but that can have easily have been an expatriate community of traders. Moreover, the tombstones, archaeologists argued, they were not indigenous. Both the materials used and the style pointed to this area, Gujarat, in northwest India. That was a sort of the stylistic features of the tombstones were Indian. Next, what we have, about a century later, are travel reports of travelers going around basically the whole Indian Ocean zone. One of them was Marco Polo, who visited Sumatra, and a century later, Ibn Battuta, famous Moroccan traveler, who also reported that in these parts of Asia there were vibrant Muslim communities. Now, because of the tombstones and the geographical proximity, a lot of people says, well, this part of the world was Islamized through India. Right? It's here, it's there. It definitely played a role in that process. There were Muslim communities on both coasts. Here, the Malabar coast, you had a lot of Arabs living here. The east coast with Coromandel, you had Muslims there. Bengal, of course, was in the process of being Islamized, and these people did indeed business with Southeast Asia, but it's not the full picture. Especially the fact that there was Arabs here, well, they were also here, and here, and here. And they come from the southern region of the Arabian Peninsula in the Yemen, the Hadramaut. These people are sort of people who, probably because of the poverty back home, wandered overseas looking for business opportunities. And they are named after their region, the Hadramaut, that they called Hadramis. And some of the biggest business families in Singapore, in Indonesia, you can still see it even from their Indonesianized or Malayized names that they are Arabs. Al-Attas, Al-Junaid, these kind of names. They're not Malay at all, they're Arab names. But after centuries, the features of these people are almost completely Malay or Southeast Asian. Yeah? So Arabs played a role as well. And of course, with Arabic being an important name within the Islamic tradition, aside from Turkish languages and Persian, one historian who sort of was engaged in explaining these connections called the Indian Ocean an Arabic-speaking Mediterranean. Because sometimes, you should do it sometimes, flip the map upside down, because these north orientations we have are very misleading, because you have this vast openness of an ocean. But if you sort of take the viewpoints of Pakistanis, Iranians, Indians, it becomes like a coastal area. Everything is connected. It is not that scary thing which Vasco da Gama faced when he turned the cape and it was just water. By the way, the pilot who guided him to Goa in 1498 was an Arab. Because the Portuguese had no idea where they were. They didn't have the nautical tools, basically, of crossing the ocean. They depended on an Arab to get to India to begin with. Yeah, so that's a little bit of geography. Now then, the other thing you have to discuss, I talked a little bit about the when. Around the 13th, 14th century, you have some indications. Now we come to the how and by whom. And that's where the differences are vast among the scholars. Now, with the Indian theory, as I will call it, prevailing, people said that's traders. They brought us now to that part of the world. Now, for sure, trade routes were like the conduits used to spread also a religion like Islam. And of course, there are very strong sort of mercantile aspects within the Islamic tradition. The Prophet himself was a businessman. And look at Quranic jargon, basically. There's a lot of merchant talk in there. Accounts are made, balances, scales. A lot of the imagery even is derived from people in an urban setting who do business. And so it's very tempting to sort of say, well, it's something being done by traders. Yeah? Two things against it. One, sort of generic. Traders want to do business. They're not missionaries. And the other thing has to do with this region. Why would they take that mercantile religion coming around the 13th, 14th century from the Middle East here, while they had been doing trade and business with another mercantile nation for millennia, the Chinese. But they never adopted Chinese religions in Southeast Asia. So business is not a sufficient explanation. It played a role. It's a composite picture I'm painting here. It's not either or, it's and. Trade routes do feature. India played a role, but so did the Middle East itself. You have to look at another thing. I go back again to the time aspect. 13th century, very important. 1256. Pop quiz in Islamic history, fall of Baghdad after the Mongol invasions. This was the last symbol of political unity in the Muslim world. Was wiped away because the Abbasid caliphs were deposed, and of course the Muslim world was already fragmented in emirates and sultanates and what have you, but now even the figurehead had disappeared. I mean, the person is sort of put in place by the Mamluks in Cairo had no real influence. It was not until the Ottomans sort of styled themselves as caliphs from the 16th century onwards that you could say, well, at least part of the Muslim world is under one figurehead again. But they had a constant competition of the Mughals in India and the Safavid Shiites from Iran. So after 1256 there is a sea change within the Muslim world with respect to political authority and unity. But there is one institution which then starts to emerge and sort of holds the social fabric of the Muslim world together. Muslim brotherhoods, the tariqas. They become very important in sort of holding, preventing that the Muslim world really rips at its seams. Because they're sort of trans-global, multinational organizations as they start emerging. And they become very important to not only keep what is already then the known Muslim world together, but also for the next phase of expansion. Because, you know, these tariqas, they are usually located in cities and towns throughout the Muslim world. Since there is no monastic tradition within Islam, you could say Sufi practitioners are sort of part-time. There's maybe people in the audience who would qualify in that sense. And it's not, you don't have to become a monk or join a monastic order to be a Sufi. You basically stand in life. Yeah? So a lot of people can basically double as businessmen and Sufi practitioners. An additional contributing factor is that what Sufism stands for may also have struck a chord, say, with the temperament of the people here. They had this rich, mystical tradition inherited from India, the Brahmanic and Hindu traditions. Now, I'm against theories that Sufism is a sort of, Buddhism or Hinduism made palatable to Muslims. I think it comes from within Islam, and maybe certain expressions are sort of colored by different cultural environments. Yeah? But by temperament, it probably struck a chord, because it's interesting that when indeed the trade routes sort of start to double also for Sufi, call them missionaries, to use the trade routes and spread the influence of their tariqas even beyond the known world, that suddenly something starts moving here in that part of the world. Because now we get in these the first indications that local people become Muslims. And it started with the rulers. And in the first instance, and I have to emphasize that again, that penetration of Islam was gradual and very slow. And it started usually with the rulers. Some scholars have said they didn't use the word conversion in the beginning. They used the word adhesion. The difference they made with that is so that the rulers kept all their options open and sort of added Islam to existing practices. Conversion happened a few generations later when people were sort of become more acquainted and confessed to be like exclusive Jews. But in the beginning, it was rulers who, had all kinds of little kingdoms here in this part of the Muslim world. This has to do with political geography of Southeast Asia. Why would these people do that? Well, again, the outward motivations of the rulers were indeed political and economical. Because compared to the mainland of Southeast Asia, the geography here is not very hospitable to agriculture. Most of it's densely jungle, mountainous, and most states, if you could call them that, petty states, were like trading posts along the coast at the mouth of a river. But there was very little economic hinterland. So what you don't have is the great empires you had in Burma, in Phagan, in Thailand, around the Ayutthaya, Cambodia, Angkor, very famous, and in Vietnam. Because there you had these vast wet rice growing cultures which created economic surplus, and that's where you find these huge monuments. They had the economic means to do that, and for that reason the political muscle. So there was a continuous pressure from these states into this region to turn these people into vassals. Warfare in this part of the world is a very complicated thing. With jungles, you cannot control land, you can control people. So usually you would wait a campaign, force a weaker ruler to pay tribute. He became technically your vassal, and that was it. A lot of these states were reduced to that status. Now, with an ally across the river with whom they shared a religion, they could make a fist. They could fend them off. So the Malay rulers here in what is now southern Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesian archipelago, actually the southern Philippines, it's part of the same cultural zone, has sort of become part of a different body politic, the Indian Ocean. They sort of divorced themselves from mainland Southeast Asia. And their allies are sort of far away, but they have a very effective network. So now you get a sort of a composite picture. Sufi influences, trade routes are used, political situation in Southeast Asia itself. These are sort of the ingredients that trigger that process and turn it into a cultural hybridity. It has elements of everything. There's Indian stuff in it, Arab, Persian, and local. It's being turned into a very localized Islam. The first indication is indeed when these rulers first adhere to Islam, then convert, is a change in name and title. What used to be Sanskrit names for kings and rulers are turned into Arabic names, and titles, these guys were like Rajas and Maharajas, Indian word for kings, they become sultans. The Sultan of Malacca, Aceh, Patani in southern Thailand. So that's a big change in identity that takes place. And that's a process that sort of unfolds between 14th, 15th, 17th centuries. And then it starts to percolate through to the lower levels. And it's like local branches of the Sufi orders that start to play a role in that. And these are the big ones, the truly trans-global ones. There is Qadriya, Naqshbandi, Kubrawiya, Shadhiliya. All the big ones are present in Southeast Asia. And these are also not exclusive. Many of the, you know it also from, say, the Arabic-speaking or the Turkish-speaking world, you can be initiated in a number of Turk at the same time. There's nothing that prevents you. And so the big names in Sufism are claimed as teachers by dozens sometimes of Muslim brotherhoods. Okay? These people become part of, say, an international network. Okay? But with its local typical things. Now, so this part of Southeast Asia, that is what is now sort of Islamized. One of the first indications that makes it a sort of typically Southeast Asian is the language. Arabic is an important medium. The Indian Ocean is a sort of Arabic-speaking Mediterranean. I sort of find that a very suitable term. But the lingua franca here, the common tongue here, is Malay, which becomes the main language for, it's a trade language even beyond Muslim Southeast Asia, but Malay becomes like the vehicle for Islamic learning. And it is also written in Arabic script from then on. Same like Ottoman Turkish. Yeah. So until, well, way into the 19th century, and in some places in southern Thailand, they still use it because it was never colonized by Western powers. So there was never a Roman alphabet introduced like in Indonesia, Singapore, and Malaysia, say in the late 1800s probably already, that they started to adopt Latin script. But in some parts, they still write Malay in Arabic script. The technical word they use is Jawi, which basically was the Arabic term. It's of course taken from the island of Java, the most populous island in the region. But it becomes a sort of the blanket term for Persians and Arabs to refer to Muslims from the Southeast Asian zone, whether it's now southern Thailand or Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines. They're called the Jawi. The script is also called Jawi, and the literature is also called Jawi. And yeah, it contains the rudiments, the very basic elements of the Islamic tenets, but it is sort of colored in with stories about local saints who played a role in introducing Islam, and there's a lot of superstition involved with tombs and barakat and magical powers and even weapons having been blessed with special powers. It's very Southeast Asian. It's only when they become more and more acquainted with the Muslim world that is sort of a clearer, say, conventional kind of Islam makes inroads. Because once this process has taken place, a sort of a local, institution of Islamic learning emerges as well, and that becomes the main vehicle in Southeast Asia. It's called in Malay, it's called pondok, and in Javanese pesantren. The English translation is usually Islamic boarding school. They're not madrasas. That's something entirely different. They come much, much later, after sort of Islamic reformism and modernism of the, say, Abdul Rida kind are introduced. But pesantren and pondok are typically Southeast Asian Islamic schools, basically. They're sort of usually on the outskirts of towns and villages, not right in the center, and there's a very strong personal relationship between what is still called the guru in the Indian world, or in Javanese, the kiai, and the murid, the students. It's almost like a replica of how tariqas are organized, with the sheikh and the murid. Yeah? So it's definitely that Sufi brotherhood influence which has sort of shaped the learning tradition, which still exists, these pesantren and ponds. We'll see that a number of people who feature in my talk about the contemporary law still have a background in these institutions. And this is a mosque, This is a mosque it's a Sumatran style, but it's actually located in southern Thailand, where a community from Sumatra migrated a few generations ago. But they sort of retained the architectural style of Sumatra, the most northern island of Indonesia. And since it's kind of cool, this is the ladies' department, and there was actually a sort of school here, right in front. No, it was active.
Is it purpose-built?
Pardon me?
Was it a purpose-built mosque when it was
Yes, it was built as a mosque. Yes, absolutely. Because this is the minaret. So having a sound system there and everything. It's just the architectural style. You would not identify it immediately. I should have brought you the other picture, because in the front it says in Arabic, Street Wad al-Hussein, or Masjid Wad al-Hussein. Yeah, so that becomes a very important vehicle. By the way, the word pondok, which is Malay, well, Malays have a problem with pronouncing F's and V's. They turn them into P's and B's. So if you turn pondok into fonduk, and I say fonduk, it's the Arabic word for an inn, isn't it? A traveler's inn. The wayfarers, the traveling students who went through the Muslim world to learn, stayed at fonduk. I mean, these one of the places. There all had to be accommodation for the Germans called the Wanderstudent. That is a very Islamic phenomenon. The very word pondok is actually sort of a Malay translation, variant translation. Is almost an adoption of that word, just pronounced slightly different, because these people have a problem pronouncing the F. It doesn't exist in Malay, that sound. So it's basically a mispronunciation of an Arabic word. Very indicative that is actually part and parcel of the Islamic tradition in that sense. Yeah? From then on, you get also really a traffic of people the other way around. Indians, Turks, Persians and Arabs spread through these tariqas, Islam, to Southeast Asia. Now the Southeast Asians get curious. They want to become good Muslims. So a return traffic starts. People are going to make Hajj, and well, nowadays Hajj is getting a visa and a flight to Saudi Arabia up and down in 2 weeks. In the past, you were going for years, and you better use your time. You made Hajj, but then you stayed on in Mecca and Medina to study for years. Of Indonesians start, and Malays, Filipinos, Southern Thai, all people from that region who have become Muslims start to do that, and they learn more and more. And they translate a lot of things from Arabic into Malay. The first tafsir is made in Malay in that time. And you have these compendia of visiting scholars who travel from Southeast Asia to Mecca and Medina, where you get like expatriate Malay communities or specific ulama who cater to the needs of Southeast Asians with all kinds of, you get these Q&A books, as I call them, often on fiqh, on Islam. What is proper behavior in these situations? Well, scholar so-and-so says that, and this gets translated into Malay. And there's typical questions which preoccupy the people in Southeast Asia, and they get answers. They were, for example, especially charmed by the Wahdat al-Wujud doctrine of Ibn Arabi. Very popular in Southeast Asia. They were acquainted with Insan al-Kamil, the book by Al-Jili, where you have this, that interesting level of 5 grades of being, of which the Wahdatul Wujud is composed. That's elaborated in Southeast Asia. Hamza al-Fansuri, first Malay Muslim poet, wrote a whole commentary and expanded it to 7 stages of being instead of the original 5. And these people sort of become pretty sophisticated philosophers and or Sufi theophists, if you want to use another word. Yes, sir. They now become part of the scholarly networks, the ulama networks. They are really extended now across the Indian Ocean into Southeast Asia, and it adds really. It's the wrong word to say proper Islamic component, but they really know what is going on and what is current in the main centers of Islamic learning, like Mecca, Haramain, Mecca and Medina, from say the 17th centuries onwards. The picture becomes much clearer because from then we have also the first manuscripts surviving in Malay, where we can read what preoccupied these people. A very good indication is that I'm going to have to show that for the moment that you know where I am. Here in the north of Sumatra you have a sultanate, it's called Aceh. Sometimes linked to the media, because Aceh is actually, even within the region, known for its fierce religious puritanism and belligerent sense of independence. But at the same time it's very cosmopolitan, because the location, see, it's at that tip basically. This is the most western point basically of Southeast Asia. So it became the staging point for the Hajj. All the ships from the region would, instead of safety in numbers, a fleet would be composed, and that would sail across the Indian Ocean to the Red Sea, and then dock at Jeddah, and people would make Hajj. That's why Aceh is often called Serambi Mecca, Mecca's veranda in Southeast Asia. And the Acehnese, I don't know if the Acehnese themselves embrace this, but people say Aceh is actually an acronym. Indonesians love acronyms. They say it's not a name, it's an acronym. Arab, Chinese, European and Hindu. All cultures converge in Aceh. And it sort of illustrates the cosmopolitanism that really I think is one of the key features of Southeast Asian Islam. Because of the position it had as a staging point for the Hajj, by the 17th century, Aceh established pretty close relationships with the new superpower in the Muslim world, Ottoman Empire, because they were responsible by then for safety and security in the Red Sea. They control the west coast of Mecca, of the Hijaz, where Mecca and Medina are. So there was, like you could say, a naval alliance between the Ottoman Empire and Aceh in the 17th century, so almost 400 years ago. They had a sort of a Islamic NATO across the Indian Ocean, with ships from the Ottomans coming if security was a bit jittery, and there was of course a lot of piracy. Probably the same areas we see in the news now, the Horn of Africa. That entry point into the Red Sea was notoriously dangerous. The Ottoman Navy provided security, surveillance, and escorts basically for the Hajjis. That's how all these relationships are. Now this cosmopolitanism and hybridity continues also, say, in the modern era, because the picture becomes only more complicated with the Europeans arriving and Southeast Asia facing colonialism. What you see from that time onwards is indeed that the rest of the Muslim world often becomes almost like a natural ally for local resistance movements against colonialism when it finds its foothold from the 17th, 18th century onwards, but later we'll see also during the embryonic stages of the independence struggle. And the education system becomes also more and more complicated. Western learning sort of comes in. And very quickly, the Muslims in Southeast Asia face the same challenges as, say, the parts of the Muslim world that are much closer to Europe. So Islamic reformism from say the Wahhabi movement of the 18th century onwards, and wave upon wave of other movements that arose, whether it's Sayyid Ahmed Khan in India, or Muhammad Abdu, Rashid Rida and al-Afghani in the Middle Eastern countries. The Muslims in Southeast Asia know about these things. One example, for example, is that in the early 1800s, the Wahhabis from Central Arabia took control of Mecca and Medina. And a number of pilgrims from Sumatra were caught up in that turmoil. But when they came home, they were they were very early Salafi or Wahhabi activists, because they used basically the doctrine of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, which is then just a generational, that only emerged in the 1760s, as a vehicle, first against their own rulers in the interior of Sumatra, because they're not Islamic enough. And later, when these rulers got desperate and called in, went the Dutch basically to back them up. The Dutch were colonizing Indonesia in that time. The same rebellious movement turned against the Dutch as well in the so-called Padri Wars. It has sort of made a big change also within Southeast Asia in leadership of opposition to colonialism. Until that time, these had been like the last remaining princes and rulers who led their people against the Dutch. By the 1830s, 1840s, you get a changing of the guard. It's Muslim reformists, it's ulama, who start to lead, say, popular uprisings, basically even challenging their own leadership. Yeah, another indication of the influence, basically, of, say, the next stage of Islamic reformism, so-called already Islamic modernism. That movement starting from al-Afghani, Abdu, Rashid Rida, 3 generations of early modernists, they get their reflections or representations in Southeast Asia. You probably have heard of that journal, Al-Manar, which Rashid Rida edited in the early 20th century, in which he sort of, in the beginning, gave exposés of the intellectual legacies of al-Afghani, and in particular Muhammad Abdu. Abdu had died relatively young, in his mid-50s, so a lot of his writings hadn't been published yet. Rashid Rida became sort of the executor of the legacy of Abdu, and he used Al-Manar, a journal that was read throughout the Muslim world, in Arabic, published in Cairo for about 30 years. That was like the main publication. It was the Newsweek or the Economist of the Muslim world for new ideas on modernization. Replicas in Malay were published in Singapore, Batavia, and other places in Southeast Asia. So from then on, from the late 19th century onwards, anything new happening in the Muslim world was usually within a year known in Southeast Asia. Because the traffic of people visiting the Middle East to study only increased because of technological advancement. Steamship. You could travel much faster now across the Indian Ocean to the holy places. And the exciting stuff was not going on in Mecca and Medina, it was in Cairo and Istanbul. So people went there to study. Those who were a bit more adventurous didn't go to the stale ulama of Mecca and Medina, they went to the exciting guys, the firebrands, the Tariq Ramadans of the 19th and early 20th century in Cairo and Istanbul. That's what these people wanted to know about. And you get also a divide within Southeast Asia among the local Muslims. You have one group, they're called Kaum Muda, which means the new folk. That is those who are sort of charmed by the ideas of Rashid Rida and Muhammad Abdu. And you get the Kaum Tua, which is the Malay word for the old folk. Those who keep going to these exotic mosques with those little chrysanthemums attached to it, where, say, the traditional body of learning is transmitted. Very much revolving around the Shafi'i law school, which is predominant in Southeast Asia. So it's very much, you know, how you picture also the learning being transmitted within traditional parts of the Middle East. It was not very different, except that they used a lot of Malay here. But most people in the Pesantren were bilingual. They knew Arabic and Malay. Often, you know, near native fluency, because some of them have spent 25 years in Mecca. teaching, visiting generations and generations of visiting pilgrims. But the kaum muda, they're a different league, and they also are politically more activist. The older group, the kaum tua, say the ones associated with these pesantren, well, even in the old society, the pesantren always was slightly separate from the community. Because that word pesantren is connected with the old Indian institution of the ashram, sort of the retreat, where you went to meditate, so it was not entirely mainstream society. These modernists were much more activist. They wanted to change their societies, not to sort of perpetuate the way things have been going on for generations, coming away from time. At that time, when these modernists become more active, they know they cannot pose an open political challenge, because don't forget, by that time Malaysia, the Philippines, Southern Thailand and Indonesia are colonies, and Dutch and British and Spanish and later Americans in the Philippines, pan-Islamic activism was a no-no. They were frantic about it, especially in the late 19th, early 20th century, when you get these overtures, also of the Kaiser, William II, with the Ottomans. There is a tremendous fear among the colonial powers in Southeast Asia that an Axis Berlin-Istanbul will interfere with the colonial empires. And it happened on occasions. Because especially, in first instance, not so much among the local Muslims, but throughout the archipelago, you had also these, what the Dutch call vreemde Oosterlingen, foreign Orientals, what a horrible word, which means like Persians, Turks, Arabs, doing business there. They're technically not citizens. They were often second rank, or they got second rank treatment. These people appealed to the Ottoman Sultan for diplomatic protection. You have to figure out, you have to look after us. It's almost like the extraterritorial treaties which, the British, the Dutch, the French had imposed on the Ottoman Empire. Well, it was tit for tat now in Southeast Asia. Arabs, Turks, Indians said, well, if the French get protection from their government when they do business in Turkey or in Lebanon, we want the same here. Yeah? But the local organizations sort of kept politics at arm's length. But one area they wanted to make an impact on, that was education. Because Islamic education was under assault in the view of the modernists from two sides. The traditionalist way of teaching, they thought it had become outdated. It was not up to the demands of the time. And of course the imposition by them of Western education by the colonial powers. By the late 19th century, there was a bit of a change of attitude in the Dutch East Indies, they called ethical policy. There was also, stealing all their resources, obviously, but there was also an obligation to sort of look after these people and provide them with education, because they were a valuable human resource as well. So, a sort of a secular Dutch education system was introduced. Some Dutch language for, say, elite segment, but also in their local tongues. But the modernists didn't like that. They said, no, we want an Islamic alternative. So, upgrading and updating an Islamic education system became very important for these people. And the first organization which sort of began to drive that agenda was a modernist organization founded by this man. There's apparently no photographs of this man, only sketches, Ahmed Dahlan. And he founded an organization called the Muhammadiyah, 1912. And it's a sort of a unique feature, I think, all throughout the Muslim world, because this became a very efficient tool for spreading and introducing a sort of a modernized Islamic education, benefiting from the reforms that had been introduced in the late 19th century by Muhammad Abdu at Al-Azhar. Abdu in sort of his second career was a sort of rehabilitated from a firebrand activist this and he had been exiled to Paris in the 1880s because of the trouble he caused for the British. Well, by the 1890s he became Grand Mufti and then rector of Al-Azhar University, and he overhauled the whole education system. The Muhammadiyah sort of wanted a replica of that for Islamic education in Indonesia. And it was very effective. Spread through the outer islands as well. Ahmed Dahlan came from Yogyakarta, which is still one of the remaining sultanates in Indonesia. Very traditional Javanese setting. But at the same time, it became also, say, the center, very oddly, of Islamic modernism in Indonesia, or what was going to become Indonesia soon. This was in 1912. The traditionalists, as I will call them, were not very happy with this. And they sort of retaliated, and they established the Nahdlatul Ulama, the revival of the ulama. In 1926, this man, Hashim Ash'ari, founded that organization. This is their logo. Overall map here, and then Nahdlatul Ulama in Arabic. They tried to counterbalance the initiatives of the Muhammadiyah, which wanted a modernized education system, and these people basically want to preserve the pesantren infrastructure, basically. Where, of course, this man, Hashim Ash'ari, was the leader of one of the largest and most respected pesantrens in Java. And these guys had quite some power. I mean, their authority was under threat. They were not very happy with that. Yeah, so you get a sort of a divide within the society, and that has had a very strange impact also on self-identification within Indonesian Muslim society. And actually, it has even got more power when an American anthropologist has sort of adopted a Javanese terminology to come up with what he said was a sort of a typology of Southeast Asian Muslims. And I think there he made a mistake. But no, maybe he did not make the mistake. People misused his typology because he was a good ethnographer. He had done research in central Java in a number of villages, and based on that he came with a typology of religion of Java. He didn't write a book, Islam in Indonesia or Islam in Java. He called it the religion of Java. But a lot of people read for religion, Islam. And you get this. These are Javanese terms or Malay terms. Abangan is a word that basically refers to the peasant class, and yeah, they're nominal Muslims, but there is a whole array of animist beliefs that sort of core their view of the world, so to speak. Priyayi is a bit the odd one out, because that is not really a religious category. That basically is an identifier of the aristocracy and the court cultures of Java. So basically you use like a class classification to describe a religion. And of course at these courts you had a lot of old Indian practices and rituals still being prevalent. Santri sort of were considered the real Muslims. These were people who pray 5 times a day, fasting, often dressed also in Arab style clothes, were very proficient in reading Quran and Arabic and things like that. And they said, well, we are the real Muslims. Well, the interesting thing, of course, is that who were the informants of Geertz? Because every anthropologist works with informants, and they cover basically the information you receive. Well, they came off from this group. So, when you ask a Santri, who sort of is a sort of, call him a scriptural Muslim, he's acquainted with the Quran and the whole body of learning, he looks down on the other ones who are, this class is illiterate. You cannot really blame them. But they sort of projected this on Javanese society and said that is how we are, but actually only these are the real Muslims. It's a bit dangerous. There are huge grey areas here in between these groups, and we will see that there are people who are sort of maybe by birth start out here, and they sort of, well then if you adopt this kind of a division throughout their life, shift towards that group. sort of bypassing this because this is what I said. You're born into that almost. That is the aristocracy. You cannot join that group. Now, this is a sort of the picture you have. I mean, this research was done in the 1950s, but it sort of is projected back in time, say, for what they said, well, this is how our society evolved over the last 100 years. And you and Mohammedia, the Nahdlatul Ulama and Mohammedia, sort of were very much into education in the first instance. But as we move closer to World War II, Muslims become engaged in the struggle for independence. And it really takes off during the war years. The Dutch always had clamped down on political Islam. The Japanese embraced it. And they allowed, even in 1943, the establishment of what is called the Majlis Shura Muslimun Indonesia. So it's a sort of a consultative council for the Muslims, with that man as the first chairman of that body. Now, as I said, Indonesians love acronyms. That Majlis Shura Muslimun Indonesia was too long. That became Masyumi, and it emerged after the Second World War as the first political party, Islamic political party in Indonesia. And that's when we get the real rift, also among Muslim politicians, because there was a tension building up between secular nationalism led by Sukarno and those Muslims who now saw their chance after the Japanese left and the Dutch trying to get back in. They saw a chance to establish an Islamic state, and that was their agenda. Sukarno, the secularist national leader and the first president, was very wary of that, because Indonesia, of course, was multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and even on Java among the Muslims there was like a strange kind of three-division being projected. So he said, if we do that, that's only a very small group of the Muslims who's actually really in favor of that. They're very vocal, but we don't want that. And they came to loggerheads. This was the leader of Masyumi at the time, Muhammad Nasser. And he drove that agenda of introducing really an Islamic Indonesia. What happened was, Sukarno said, no, we must have a secular state. Okay, said the Muslims, but they added, we want one stipulation in our constitution for the Muslims, because one of the things Sukarno was accepting, he says, okay, all Indonesians have to believe in one God. But he didn't specify that. And the Muslim from the Masyumi were not stupid. They said, okay, we can go with that, but we want an addition. We want in the constitution a line which says, with the obligation for Indonesia's Muslims to adhere to Sharia. In Malay that is, dengan kewajiban menjalankan syariat Islam bagi pemeluk-pemeluknya. These are 7 words in Malay. And they become the notorious 7 words, which were part of the Jakarta Charter, which was a deal between Sukarno and Masyumi. Okay, we become independent, then this is going to be the constitution. At 5 to 12, actually 1 to 12, when he read out the Declaration of Independence, he dropped the 7 words. Basically, Masyumi felt cheated. And ever since, it was always coined as just get the 7 words back into the constitution. That became the agenda for, say, until now, the debate in Indonesia. Because this became the national ideology. This is a sort of, well, except for the first thing, which is sort of caters a bit to a religious element, but it's very neutral, it's very general, believe in one God. But everything else, well, that is a sort of Sukarno's variety of Kemalism. It's all very secular. The Panchasila, the 5 doctrines. It's an old Sanskrit word, basically. The very fact that he doesn't use an Arabic term is already indicative. So that became a problem, and it caused a lot of political instability in the 50s and 60s, to the extent that Maashumi really became like the arch enemy of the secular nationalists. The party broke up because originally both the Nahdlatul Ulama, the traditionalists, and the modernists of the Muhammadiyah had been part of Maashumi. But in 1952, because in the view of the traditionalists, the modernists were driving too hard the bargain, they stepped out of the party. And NU, the Nahdlatul Ulama, became a political party in its own right, more subdued, and of course they were favored. Ever since then, under Sukarno, a very important post in the cabinet, Minister of Religion, went to an NU alim, scholar from the NU, no longer somebody from the Maashumi party, which now existed only of modernists. And the modernists also became involved in all kinds of regional uprisings. There was trouble in West Java, South Sulawesi, Aceh, all over the place, and this of course threatened the territorial integrity of the whole region, of the whole of Indonesia, which was, from the beginning, Sukarno's concern. He didn't want those 7 words in it because he was trying to forge a nation of Indonesians. Just I imagine as Atatürk had to make out of a fragmented Ottoman Empire a Turkish republic. And the challenge maybe in Indonesia was bigger. 16,000 islands, 300 ethnic groups, I don't know how many languages. Islam could not feature overtly in that, according to Sukarno. But the Maashumi, of course, disagreed and used often in the regional dissatisfaction with all the control coming from Java, and Sukarno being a Javanese, to sort of stir the pot in the outer islands like Sumatra, Sulawesi, places like that. The only thing sort of that was allowed under Sukarno, and this is sort of the religion map you have in the area, was he sort of catered to these old agendas of the education system. So very strange in a country which is sort of has a very secular constitution, at the same time the state provided an Islamic education system. But there was much more openness to it than, for example, what Diyanet would allow. It's not imam training only. These became, and I'll rush here a bit, full-fledged universities. Now, no, it's really academic. There were some faculties where you could study, like Usuluddin or Sharia, and then you could become an imam, khatib, or the Indonesian variety of that. But a lot of people went there for academic reasons, because they offered much broader programs. The people who sort of, well, the system was put in place after World War I. By the 1960s, we get a shift of power in Indonesia. Sukarno has shifted more and more to the left. There was a coup, 65, 66, by the military against Sukarno, because there was allegations that he was supporting a communist conspiracy to kill the top generals of the army. And that was the only excuse the army needed. And that is when Suharto took power. The president was ousted in 1998. Right after the coup, something sinister happened. There was a persecution of communists in Indonesia, and it was very ethnic driven. Most of the communists, or alleged communists, Chinese, and there were sort of like militias, Muslim militias, who helped the army in hunting these people down. Figures vary how many people were killed, but it was in the hundreds of thousands at least. They needed some reward, and the Maashumi party thought they would be allowed back in. Well, that didn't happen. Suharto was not going to make the mistake that Sukarno had sort of avoided. But what happened was that although Mashumi was not allowed to re-establish it, so the whole 7 words story did not feature also under the Sukarno years, but once he took power in 67-68, he went for another overhaul of the Islamic education system because they thought it had become outdated again in the previous 25 years. These people are key in that process. That is what I call the first generation of these contemporary thinkers. Mukti Ali, who became the Minister of Religion in 1970s, and Harun Nasution, who became the rector of the Islamic University in Jakarta. Now, both these men received their PhDs not at Al-Azhar or anywhere in the Muslim world. They went to Canada. They went to McGill University, where they got PhDs in Islamic civilization from the Institute of Islamic Studies, basically run at a secular Western university. But this was the beginning of a completely new generation of Muslim intellectuals. Because these 2 guys, which I showed you earlier, they had already senior positions in the government by the 1960s, 70s. This man inherited the mantle in the NU in the 1980s and became basically the chairman of the NU. Well, I had to leave something on, but this man is the grandson of the founder of the NU. That man. Yeah? And it basically became a dynasty. Now, he is also not your average alim. He was the son of a whole generation of Pesantren ulama, but he himself studied first at Cairo University and then in Baghdad. And the other person who was very important in the second generation is this man, Nurholis Majid, who became the head of the student union, the Muslim Student Union in 1968. Now, he was politically very savvy, even to the extent that he was often dubbed the young Nasir, the guy who had led the Mashumi party, because everybody thought if somebody should be competent to create the critical mass to introduce an Islamic state, it would be him. Well, within a year, he had for the old Mashumi establishment, which was still not allowed back into politics, a terrible surprise, because he gave a speech. He gave 2 speeches in those years that he was the chairperson, but in this one, there was a sentence, a slogan basically he launched: Islam yes, Islamic party no. That's what he said. And maybe in the question and answer I can go into that a bit. He had a very sophisticated view of how Indonesian society should function. He also drove the agenda of secularization, not secularism, a point often lost or maybe willfully ignored by his opponents who wanted an Islamic state. But he said no, a modern state must, number 1, secularize. That what he means by that is that human life in the here and now among people is governed by temporal values. Your relationship with God, vertical dimension, that's eternal. It's almost like ibadat versus muamalat, if you look at legal terms. A lot of people didn't go for that, or sort of didn't want to understand it, because he says secularization goes in tandem with something else, desacralization. Politics must be desacralized. So there's nothing sacred about politics. Actually, he says, it's almost demeaning to religion, insulting to religion, to the transcendent, to get it involved in daily politics, because it's murky. And I don't want that. And he gave 2 speeches in which he laid that out, very intellectual, and that's why a lot of people maybe really didn't understand it, but his opponents were at least as well educated, but it didn't suit them. But under the Suharto regime, he sort of got the space to inform them, and he became gradually more sophisticated. He went, after he finished as the chairperson of the student union, he got a scholarship to go to Chicago, because that's where he did his PhD. Also again in the West, just like the 2 guys who sort of had reorganized and overhauled the education system, also Nurholis Majid, did not go to Al-Azhar or Mecca or to any, say, traditionalist Islamic education, although in his childhood he had attended a Pasantren. But he went to America and did a PhD on Ibn Taymiyyah. Interesting, very sophisticated one. When he came back, and that is why he had a sort of gotten a bit more appreciation for the Islamic tradition, and this became his new slogan: preserving from the old what is good and adopting from the new what is bad. It's Malay, that's the Arabic origin. That became his new slogan. And he set up a thing, this is the Dialogue Society of Indonesia. That's really, I think you can compare it, because when he came back in the 80s, Indonesia had really changed, very much so. The fallout of the reforms of Mukti Ali and Harun Nasution had taken a foothold, and that was germinating now, because in the 70s Indonesia had an economic boom, they had oil and everything, so you got this Muslim yuppies, I have no other word for it, in the big cities, who start to have cars and later computers and mobile phones, but they're missing something spiritual. And you get a form of what Julia Day Howell says, urban Sufism. That's not whirling dervishes, although I like that stuff, the exotic part of it. No, these were sort of discussion groups and sort of seminars on meditation and things like that, and personal improvement, and that was done by the Yayasan Waqf. You have the word Waqf in it, but Yayasan means foundation. And now Paramedina even has a university, but that became a very strong vehicle in, these are these yuppies, these are now leading figures in Indonesia's Muslim intelligentsia, because these people were looking for something, and the political establishment noticed it, because there was more and more openness to Islam in society, and the big changes come in the late 80s, early 90s. The most important indication is 1991, when Suharto, President Suharto, suddenly changes his name into Mohammed Suharto and goes on Hajj, with a whole entourage of big businessmen and military leaders. This is a big difference with Turkey. I think the military still stays very far away from anything Islamic. In Indonesia, you get a phenomenon they call kehijauan, the greening of the military. And it has nothing to do with their uniforms, it has to do with what represents the color of Islam is green. So it was the greening of the military establishment, which basically creates a sort of a nurturing environment, because they are the power players, that this civil society is allowed to emerge. Because that was a kind of an Islam that was not scary to the political establishment. Hey, their children were in it. And, well, Nurholis Majid died a few years ago of kidney failure. Abdurrahman Wahid, you probably have heard of, Gus Dur, became the president after the Suharto regime collapsed because of the mishandling of the economic crisis. Screwed up a bit because he was too mercurial to be a politician. That man is a real character. I mean, Muslim alim, but also connoisseur of French film noir. Ask him anything about sports, he knows it. He did sports commentaries even, as an alim, on TV and on the news. He can do anything. So the Bishop of Canterbury and Gary Lineker in one, he could do that. But it was not ideal to be a politician in that way. These are the young people now. Well, he's not so young anymore, but Kumar Hidayat that put him not only up because he's the rector now of the Islamic University in Jakarta, but he got a PhD in Western philosophy with Scam. This guy is now in Harvard doing a PhD. He set up the liberal Islamic network, which got into real trouble with the ulama because it was considered too liberal. This was his sidekick, who is now in Australia.
Is he Indonesian? Is it what F is that?
Lutfi, yeah, that is an Arabic name, so probably 90% of the Downese calls them probably Lutfi. And Ashokani, I mean, these guys have really also sort of, very Arab names. Yeah, I'll come to a close. There is people like Ahmed Basso who sort of are sometimes thinking these guys go too far in their liberalism. And he calls himself not a traditionalist. I find him the most interesting cat in Indonesia. He calls himself, again, as an acronym, POSTRA, which stands for post-traditionalism. He thinks he can preserve a sort of the pesantren type of learning, of transmitting, the way, basically a whole body of learning that has been transmitted through the centuries in Islam, but he wants to reread it through postmodernist philosophy. This guy writes about Al-Shafi'i and Foucault in one article. Makes for very interesting reading, and I want to read more by this guy in the future. Because I think this is a sort of, these people for the next 10 years probably will color what's going on in Indonesia. And they have been doing only so for the last 5 to 10 years maybe. So it's still very early. But I think this is the third generation of young Turks, which will make Indonesian Islam. It's a very different one from Eventide in Ramadan or Amr Khaled in Egypt now. I think it's more adventurous, intellectually even, than what these people do. But I think I'm running out of time.